She wasn't supposed to be the one who saved him. She was just supposed to clear the table by the window and go home. It was 11:47 on a Thursday night in February, and the temperature in Halifax had dropped to -19 with the wind chill. Cora Finley had been on her feet since 4 in the afternoon, her non-slip shoes soaked through from a soup spill she'd dealt with around 7, and her last table, a couple who'd split a single bowl of French onion soup and argued about the bill for 20 minutes, had left her a $1.50 tip on a $40 check. She was done. She was so done. The diner was called The Anchor. It sat on the corner of Barrington and South, the kind of place that had been there so long the booths had grooves worn into the vinyl from decades of elbows. Cora had worked there for 3 years, long enough to know every crack in the ceiling tile and every customer who came in alone on a weekday. She was 22 years old, had $68 in her checking account, and had been putting off a dentist appointment since September because she couldn't afford the copay. But none of that matters right now. What matters is what she found in the alley behind the diner when she went out to bring the recycling to the bin at 11:53. She almost didn't see him. The alley behind the Anchor was narrow and badly lit. One flickering overhead lamp that the building manager had been promising to fix since October. Cora had her earbuds in, listening to a podcast about Canadian true crime, which in hindsight she would later say was either terrible or perfect timing. She had the recycling bin in one hand, and she was already thinking about the bus she needed to catch at midnight when she almost tripped over what she thought was a garbage bag. It wasn't a garbage bag. He was maybe 7 years old. A little boy in a dark wool coat, the kind with the toggle buttons, the kind that costs more than Cora made in a week. He was unconscious on the pavement, half slumped against the brick wall, his cheek pressed against the wet concrete, one small hand curled open beside his face, like he'd just fallen asleep mid-reach. Cora dropped the recycling bin. She was on her knees before she had a conscious thought about it. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck the way she'd learned in a first aid course she'd taken 4 years ago at the YMCA, and she felt it. A pulse, weak and thin, but there. He was breathing. Shallow. Wrong. She pulled out her phone to call 911. And then she noticed his hand, the open one, curled on the concrete. He was holding a phone. A real one, not a cheap kid's model. A device that looked like it cost more than her rent. The screen was cracked but lit up, and across it, in large print the way someone sets text size for a child who's still learning to read, was a single entry saved under the name, Daddy. Cora called 911 first. She gave them the address. She said it clearly. She stayed calm in the way that people stay calm when their adrenaline is doing the work for them and the fear hasn't caught up yet. The dispatcher told her to keep the boy on his side, not to move him, stay on the line. She stayed on the line, and then, while she was kneeling in a wet Halifax alley with one hand on a child's back to make sure his chest kept rising and falling, she picked up his phone with her other hand and pressed Daddy. She didn't think about what kind of man answers a call from an unknown number at midnight and picks up on the first ring. She found out when he picked up before it finished the first tone. Elliot. The voice was not a question. It was low and even and absolutely controlled, the way a voice sounds when the person it belongs to has spent years making sure nothing they feel ever reaches the surface. Where are you? Cora said. This isn't Elliot. Silence. Not the silence of confusion. Not the silence of a man who's startled. It was the silence of a man who goes very, very still when something unexpected happens, the way a predator goes still, not out of fear but out of calculation. Who is this? Still not a question. My name is Cora. I work at a diner on Barrington Street. I found a little boy in the alley behind the kitchen. He's unconscious. I've already called 911 and they're on their way, but he had this phone and your number was, what alley? Behind the Anchor Diner. On Barrington at South. Don't move. 2 words. Absolute. Not a request, not a suggestion. An instruction the way gravity is an instruction. Don't go anywhere. Don't talk to anyone. Stay with my son. The line went dead. Cora looked at the phone in her hand. Then she looked at the little boy on the pavement, at his toggle-button coat and his small curled fingers, and the way his eyelashes rested against his cheek like he was just sleeping, just peacefully sleeping, if you didn't look at the color of his lips. She stayed. The ambulance arrived in 4 minutes. The man arrived in 6. By the time she heard the vehicles, not one, not two, but 3 black SUVs pulling into the alley from both ends simultaneously, blocking it off like a seal. The paramedics had already stabilized the boy and were loading him onto the stretcher. Cora was standing to the side the way they'd asked her to, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, her recycling job entirely forgotten. The doors of the middle SUV opened. The man who stepped out was not what she expected. She hadn't known what she expected, exactly. She hadn't had time to build an expectation, but it wasn't this. He was tall, late 30s, wearing a charcoal suit under a wool overcoat that probably cost more than the Anchor made in a month. His hair was dark and cut close. His face was the kind of face that doesn't move much, controlled, like the voice on the phone. But his eyes went straight to the stretcher, and for one single moment, just one, something crossed his face that was so raw and so human it almost didn't belong there, like watching a crack appear in stone. He crossed the alley in 4 strides, spoke to the paramedic in a low, rapid voice, and then he put one hand on the side of the stretcher, not clutching, not grabbing, just resting his palm against the metal bar, like he needed to feel that it was real, that the boy was there, that the boy was breathing. The paramedic said something. The man nodded once. Then he looked up. He looked directly at Cora. She felt it like a change in air pressure. He said, "You're Cora." It was not a question either. Yes. He studied her the way people study something they need to assess quickly and accurately, taking in her diner uniform, her wet shoes, the recycling bin, still lying on its side 5 feet away. He said, "You called it in?" "Yes." "You stayed?" "Yes." A pause. Then he said, "Get in the car." Cora blinked. "I'm sorry. My son is going to the IWK. I'm following the ambulance." "You're coming." She stared at him. I don't know you." The man looked at her steadily. "My name is Vincent Harlow. I know you don't know me. I'm asking you to come to the hospital so I can speak with you about what you saw." A pause. "I'm asking." Something about the way he said that, the pause before it, the slight emphasis like it cost him something, made her go still. She said, "Am I in danger if I say no?" A long moment. Then, for the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something quieter. "No," he said. "You're not." She got in the car. If you're just joining Ella's Romance Library, welcome. You're going to want to hit subscribe and stay, because this story is only getting started. And if you've been here before, you already know, we don't do anything halfway around here. Like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think Cora should do next, and let's get into it. The IWK Health Center was 20 minutes away. Cora sat in the back of the SUV with Vincent Harlow and said nothing for the first 10 minutes, because she had no idea what to say. He didn't speak either. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped and his eyes on the window, watching the Halifax streets go by in the dark. The salt-stained roads, the yellow pools of streetlight, the occasional lit-up window in an apartment above a takeout place. His face was completely still. But his right hand, Cora noticed, tightened and released against his left at a slow, rhythmic pace, like a man holding himself together by counting. She said quietly, "His name is Elliot?" "Yes." "How old is he?" 8. Cora nodded. She looked out her own window. Then she said, "He had a pulse when I found him. I checked." Vincent Harlow turned his head and looked at her. It was the first time he'd looked at her directly since the alley. He said, "I know. The paramedic told me." A pause. "You knew to check. I took a first aid course. Most people don't use it when it matters." Cora didn't say anything to that. At the hospital, things moved fast, the way things move fast when doors open before you reach them, and staff appear without being called, and nobody asks a man like Vincent Harlow to fill out paperwork at a front desk. Cora stayed close because she didn't know what else to do, and because one of the men in suits, Vincent's men, she understood now, the ones who'd been in the other SUVs, had positioned himself in a way that made her understand. She wasn't being invited to wander. She wasn't being held. She was being kept track of. There was a difference, she told herself. She was pretty sure there was a difference. A doctor came out and spoke to Vincent in a low voice. Cora watched Vincent's face while he listened. It stayed very still. When the doctor finished, Vincent asked 2 questions. She couldn't hear them, and the doctor answered, and then Vincent nodded and said something that made the doctor leave quickly. He turned to Cora. Elliot is stable, he said. He's going to be all right. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. However, Vincent said, the preliminary blood work is showing something the doctors find unusual. They want to run more tests. His jaw tightened, just slightly. It appears my son may have been given something. Cora felt the alley again, the weight of the boy, the color of his lips. Given something, she repeated, as in, someone hurt him deliberately. That's what I intend to find out. She looked at him. He was watching her with that same steady, assessing look from the alley. She said, "Why am I here, Mr. Harlow?" "Because you found him," he said, "and that means you were in the alley at the right time, which means you may have seen something you don't realize you saw. I didn't see anyone else. Tell me everything anyway. From the moment you walked out of the kitchen." So she did. She told him about the recycling bin, and the podcast, and the flickering light, and how she almost tripped. She told him about the wool coat with toggle buttons, and the cracked phone, and the big print contact saved as Daddy. She told him about the pulse, the thin, wrong pulse, and the way she'd called 911 first, before she called him, because she wasn't thinking about anything except keeping the boy alive. When she finished, Vincent was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You called 911 before you called me." "Of course." "Why, of course?" She frowned at him. "Because he needed an ambulance. That was the first thing he needed." Something moved across Vincent Harlow's face, brief, unguarded. He said, "Most people, when they realize who that number belongs to, call me first." Cora said, "I didn't know who you were, you know now." She held his gaze. "I called the ambulance first because that's what the situation needed. If I'd known who you were, I would have done the same thing in the same order." Another long pause. He said, "You're not afraid of me." It wasn't quite true, and they both probably knew it. But Cora said, "I'm more concerned about Elliot than I am about you. That might be a temporary condition." For the first time, Vincent Harlow almost smiled. They sat in the family waiting room for 2 hours. Vincent's men cycled in and out, whispering to him, receiving nods, disappearing again. Cora gathered, from fragments she wasn't meant to hear, and questions she probably wasn't meant to ask, that the investigation into how Elliot had come to be unconscious in an alley behind a diner was already well underway. She gathered that it was not the kind of investigation the Halifax Regional Police would be consulted on. Around 2 in the morning, a nurse came to tell them Elliot was awake and asking for his father. Vincent stood immediately. Then he stopped and looked at Cora. She was sitting in a plastic chair with a vending machine coffee going cold between her hands, her diner uniform wrinkled, her wet shoes finally starting to dry. He said, "Will you wait?" She looked up at him. "You're asking again?" "Yes." She nodded. "Go see your son." He was gone for 40 minutes. When he came back, something in his bearing had shifted. Not softer, exactly, but settled. Like a man who had put down something very heavy and was learning to stand straight again. He sat down across from her. He said, "Elliot wants to meet you." Cora blinked. "Me?" He asked if the lady who called for help was still here. Vincent looked at her steadily. "I told him yes." She set down the coffee. She stood. She straightened her diner uniform like that would help anything, which it did not. She followed Vincent Harlow down the corridor toward the room where his son lay in a hospital bed with monitors attached to him and a drip in his small arm and a look on his face. When Cora walked through the door, that was so purely, so honestly relieved to see a stranger that it hit her somewhere behind the sternum like a physical thing. "You're the one who found me," Elliot Harlow said. Not a question. A statement of fact from a child who had his father's way with certainty. Cora sat down in the chair beside his bed. "I am. My name's Cora. My name's Elliot." He looked at her seriously. "I remember being cold." "You were very cold," she said. "But you did great. You held on." He considered this. "Were you scared?" She considered lying. She said, "A little. But I've taken a first aid course, so I knew what to do." Elliot nodded slowly. Then he said, "My dad says you stayed with me the whole time." She glanced at Vincent, who was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and his face neutral. She looked back at Elliot. "I wasn't going to leave." Elliot reached out and put his hand on top of hers, a small, certain, trusting hand, and said, "Thank you, Cora." She had to look at the ceiling for a moment. "You're very welcome, Elliot." she said, when she could say it without her voice doing something embarrassing. The man who had put Elliot Harlow in that alley was named Serge Beaumont. He was the head of logistics for a business rival who had been looking for a way to send Vincent Harlow a message that couldn't be ignored. He had hired 2 men and given them a child and a time and an address, and he had been very careful about it, and he had made one significant miscalculation. He had not accounted for Cora Finley. He had not accounted for a waitress who took her recycling out at 11:53 instead of midnight, who had taken a first aid course 4 years ago at a YMCA and actually retained it, who called 911 first because that was simply the obvious and correct thing to do, and who wouldn't have let go of that child's hand for anything. The 2 men Beaumont had hired were in Vincent Harlow's custody by 4 in the morning. This was not something Cora was told directly, but she heard enough, sitting in that waiting room, to understand the shape of it. What she didn't expect was what happened at 6:15, just as the gray February dawn was beginning to press against the hospital windows. Vincent came to find her one more time. He sat across from her. He said, without preamble, "I know what you heard." Cora said, "I didn't hear anything specific." "Cora." She looked at him. He said, "You understand what I am. I have some sense of it. And you're still sitting here." "Your son just thanked me for not leaving him in an alley," she said. "I'm not going anywhere until I know he's actually going to be all right." Vincent studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "The people who hurt Elliot will not be able to do so again. I believe you. The people responsible for ensuring his safety failed. That will not happen again either." She nodded. "You," he said, "are a different matter." She went very still. "You did not ask for any of this," he said. "You were taking out recycling. You found my son and you kept him alive, and you did not run, and you did not use what you saw to your advantage, and you have been sitting in this hospital for 6 hours in wet shoes." He paused. "You are a witness to things that could cause problems." Cora said carefully, "Are you telling me I have a problem?" "No," he said immediately. "I'm telling you that I owe you a debt that I have no framework for repaying, and that because of what you saw tonight, certain people may eventually connect your name to this, which means—" He stopped, measured something, "whether you want it or not. That is not negotiable." She stared at him. "You can't just decide that. I'm aware it's an unusual situation. I don't want to be in your world, Mr. Harlow." "I know." He held her gaze. "But my world has already touched yours. That's not something I can undo. What I can do is make sure nothing follows you from it that you can't handle." She sat with that for a moment. She said, "Elliot asked me if I'd come see him again." Vincent's expression shifted. Something very quiet moved through it. "He did. What did you tell him?" "I told him I would ask you." Cora looked at the window. The light was coming up over the harbor, pale and cold and February gray, the way Halifax mornings are in winter. Not pretty, exactly, but real. The kind of light that doesn't flatter anything, but shows you everything clearly. She said, "I get off shift at 3 on Sundays." Vincent Harlow looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I'll have someone pick you up," she said. "I'll take the bus." The pause before he responded was very brief, but she caught it. He said, "All right." She stood up, picked up her coat, and wrapped it around herself. She walked to the door of the waiting room. She stopped. Without turning around, she said, "Tell Elliot the first aid course was at the Bayers Lake YMCA. They do one every March. He should take it when he's old enough." She left without waiting for a response. She found out later, much later, months later, in a different waiting room in a different situation she also hadn't planned on being in, that Vincent Harlow had stood in that hospital corridor and watched her walk away, and that one of his men had leaned over and said quietly, "You want us to follow her?" And Vincent had said, "No, she could talk, she won't." "How do you know?" And Vincent Harlow, the head of the Harlow organization, the man they called the harbor in certain circles because nothing moved in or out of Halifax without his knowing, had looked down the corridor where Cora Finley had just disappeared in her wrinkled diner uniform and her almost dry shoes, and he had said, very quietly, "Because she called the ambulance first. So here's what I want you to think about." Cora Finley walked into that alley to take out recycling. She walked out of it connected to one of the most powerful and dangerous men in Atlantic Canada. connected in a way that neither of them chose, and neither of them can entirely undo. She saved his son. He's sworn to protect her, and neither of them knows yet what that's going to cost. Do you think Cora should have walked away when she had the chance? Or was the moment she picked up that phone, the moment she pressed Daddy, the moment her real life finally started? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you want to find out what happens when Sunday afternoon comes and Cora rings that doorbell, subscribe to Ella's Romance Library because we are just getting started.